What happens when a cop pulls over a black woman driving a nice car and finds out too late she's the judge he'll be standing in front of tomorrow? This isn't just a story of profiling gone wrong. It's a masterclass in quiet power. Dignity and justice served cold. Stay with us, because what started as disrespect on the road ends with accountability in court. This is one story you'll never forget, and neither will that officer. Before the courtroom, before the viral headlines, before the citations and the dash cam, and the moment the robe came off, there was just a road, a car, and a choice. That's how stories like these always begin. Quiet, unassuming. Like the start of a day that doesn't know it's about to become history. It was a warm morning in Fulton County, Georgia. The kind where the sun glints off the hood of every car like a signal flare. Judge Vanessa Cole, robe draped neatly over her passenger seat, was on her way to the courthouse. Her docket was heavy. Arraignments, bail hearings, a high-profile, pre-trial conference. But her mind was clear. She had driven this route 100 times. Nothing unusual. Nothing to expect, except that Officer Brad Mallory was bored. He was 32, white, 3 years into his patrol shift, and 2 hours into a morning with no calls. The department didn't reward calm. They noticed activity. So when he saw a sleek Mercedes glide through a stop sign half a second longer than it should have, he flipped on the lights. He didn't know who was inside. He just knew the math didn't add up. Woman. Black. Alone. Nice car. In that zip code. That equation had always triggered something in him. He didn't question where it came from. He just acted. Mallory thought. This was going to be routine. Maybe a citation, maybe a search, maybe a smug warning. But what he didn't know, and what he was about to learn the hard way, is that the person behind the wheel was someone who wrote the laws he only pretended to understand. Judge Vanessa Cole didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She didn't need to. That's not how she fought. She fought with precision, with silence, with the law. And what began as a stop over suspiciously slow driving would become a reckoning for far more than a broken tail light, because this story isn't just about one officer's power trip. It's about what happens when that trip collides with the wrong woman, or rather, the right one. What followed was a cascade of accountability. A shift in power Mallory never saw coming, a courtroom he would never forget, and the slow, subtle undoing of his badge, not by violence or protest, but by evidence, truth, and someone who knew exactly what justice was supposed to look like. And in the end, even Mallory wouldn't walk away unchanged. Because this wasn't a story about revenge, it was about responsibility, the kind that catches up with you when you least expect it, so buckle in. Because today's story isn't fiction, it's what happens when justice wears a robe, but still, gets pulled over. Judge Vanessa Cole believed in the law like some people believed in faith. Not blindly, but as something that could be shaped, sharpened, held accountable. She had spent 15 years doing just that from the bench, measured, respected, never reckless with her power. That morning, she left her driveway as she always did, coffee in hand, court briefs in her bag, robe carefully folded in the passenger seat. Her silver Mercedes moved through the quiet Atlanta suburb like clockwork. She'd just passed Birchwood Drive when the blue lights appeared. Behind her, a cruiser crawled up fast. Vanessa glanced in the mirror. No siren, just lights. Her stomach tightened. Not from guilt, but from familiarity. She signaled, slowed, and pulled into the shoulder. Her hands went instinctively to 10 and 2. Her pulse didn't race, but her thoughts moved. No speeding. Full stop at the last light, no distractions. She reviewed it like evidence. Then, through the mirror, she saw him. Officer Brad Mallory stepped out with the practiced swagger of a man who'd never questioned his right to be feared. Buzz cut, wraparound shades, hand hovering near the holster, not drawn, just close. He approached her window with the kind of energy that said, "I'm the story here." "Nice car," he said, leaning in just enough. "Didn't know Publix?" "Defenders made Mercedes money." Vanessa turned to him slowly, her expression neutral. "Good morning, officer. I'm not a public defender." "No?" His eyes scanned the interior. "You live around here?" "Yes, 2 blocks east." He chewed gum with the slow rhythm of someone already convinced they'd won. "You were doing 30 and a 35. That's a little cautious, don't you think? Got me wondering if you were hiding something. Any drugs, weapons, alcohol I should know about?" "No," she answered. "You hesitated." I paused. "Because the question doesn't make sense," he smirked. "License and registration." Vanessa handed over her license, insurance, registration, all in order. He barely looked at them. "Vehicles registered to you?" "Yes." "As the paperwork." "Shows!" "You people always got something to say," he muttered, then walked off toward his cruiser. She watched him in the mirror. Something in his stride changed. Not angry, smug, like the game was already over. And then, crack. A small pop echoed from the rear. Vanessa craned her neck, alarm flashing behind her eyes. Mallory had walked to her tail light and struck it, gently, but firmly, with the base of his flashlight. The red plastic fractured instantly. When he returned, he wore a satisfied smile. 2 citations, he said. Reckless driving, broken tail light. Vanessa opened the door and stepped out slowly, calm but deliberate. "That tail light wasn't broken until you hit it." He took a step toward her. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job. And you don't get to fabricate probable cause." She walked back to the passenger seat and lifted her black leather briefcase, clicked it open. Inside, a gleaming gold badge sat atop a case file. She held it up. No flourish, no heat. Just fact. "I'm Judge Vanessa Cole, Fulton County Superior Court, and this morning, I'm presiding over a suppression hearing involving police misconduct. Do you want to be Exhibit A?" The air stilled. The traffic nearby faded. Even the birds quieted. Mallory's eyes darted to her badge, then back to her face. His mouth opened, but no words came. Vanessa let the silence stretch. Then she placed the badge back in her case and closed it with a soft click. "You made assumptions." "Then you made a mistake," Mallory stammered. "Judge, ma'am, look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. I can void the citations." "I'm not asking for favors," she said. "I'm asking for accountability, which you're clearly not used to giving." He swallowed hard. "You don't need to report this. I didn't know." "No, you didn't, and that's exactly the issue." She got back in the car, closed the door, shifted into drive. Before she pulled away, she looked once more in the rearview mirror. Mallory stood motionless, hands at his sides, no clipboard, no bravado, and no idea that she had recorded the entire encounter. Not with a phone, but with the discreet dash cam under her mirror. It had caught everything: his words, his tone, the strike to the tail light. Vanessa didn't drive off angry. She drove off resolved, because this wasn't just another stop. It was a warning shot. Not to her, but from her. She had seen this pattern too many times. She had read the transcripts, heard the testimonies, watched families cry in courtrooms after things had gone much worse. She knew how quickly a routine stop could become a headline or a tragedy. But she also knew something else. Power didn't come from a badge or a bench. It came from knowing what to do when you were underestimated. And Vanessa Cole had just been underestimated by the wrong man. The street was quiet again, the flashing lights gone. the citations tucked into Vanessa Cole's briefcase, not because she accepted them, but because she intended to bury them under a stack of legal filings. By the time she reached the courthouse, her game face was on, but inside, something had shifted. Not just frustration, clarity. She parked in her reserved space, gathered her things, and adjusted the robe over her arm. The courtroom that awaited her wasn't just another docket today. It was a mirror, a reminder that justice could be swift, but rarely fair, and almost never blind. She entered, nodded to the bailiff, and took her seat on the bench. Officer Mallory had no idea that while he sat in his cruiser filling out a half-fake incident report, the woman he tried to belittle was stepping into the very system he thought he controlled. It didn't take long for news to ripple through courthouse halls. A deputy clerk overheard her mention the stop to the court reporter. Another judge leaned in during lunch and asked, "Was it Mallory?" Her silence said more than yes. Meanwhile, Mallory began to feel something unusual. Nerves. That afternoon, a supervisor called him in, said there was talk, asked if anything had happened during his patrol that morning. Mallory lied. Just a routine stop. His tone was casual, but inside, his gut was tightening. Because something about that woman's eyes when she said, "Do you want to be Exhibit A?" hadn't left him. Vanessa didn't go straight to internal affairs. Not yet. She filed a formal complaint. Through the court liaison office first. Quietly, formally. A process she knew Mallory wouldn't be expecting. The kind of move someone makes when they don't just want to make noise, they want to make change. But she wasn't finished. That night she reviewed the dash cam footage, frame by frame. His posture, his tone, the moment his flashlight cracked, the tail light. She uploaded it to a private server and copied it onto a thumb drive. Then she called two people, her former law clerk, now a civil rights attorney, and a friend in local media. "Off the record for now," she said. "But I need this archived, just in case." Within 48 hours, Mallory's name was flagged in a judicial advisory memo circulated through the Fulton County justice system. Unofficial, but watched. A pattern of behavior. A reputation that had long been whispered about, now tethered to an undeniable video file. 3 days later, the spark hit the powder. A local journalist published a piece titled, "When Power Pulls You Over, a Judge's Traffic Stop Raises Big Questions." The article didn't name Mallory, but the details were clear enough for insiders. Screenshots from the dash cam were included. Mallory cracking the tail light, Vanessa's calm face behind the wheel. The story spread like dry fire through legal, Twitter, community forums, and eventually, morning television. Vanessa didn't seek the spotlight, but the spotlight found her. She was invited onto a Sunday legal roundtable. She declined. The press staked out the courthouse. She gave no comment. But behind the scenes, she kept moving. She requested Mallory's disciplinary record under Georgia's public transparency laws. She called a civil oversight board member she once ruled in favor of, and most of all, she kept showing up to work, robe on, gavel firm, case by case demonstrating the dignity that had been denied to her on the side of that road. Mallory, on the other hand, unraveled slowly. The department had no choice but to open a preliminary review. The citations had already been pulled from records. They had disappeared. The day after the stop, a fact that raised more questions than it answered. Someone in records leaked that Mallory had been advised to keep a low profile. His cruiser was reassigned for a week. He was taken off solo patrol. In private, he panicked, checked his name in news alerts, read every comment, every thread. "He picked the wrong black woman," one said. "You can't hide from the truth forever," said another. "He didn't sleep well, didn't speak much at the station." One of his buddies joked, "Man, you really screwed the pooch with that judge." Mallory didn't laugh. Something about her composure haunted him. She hadn't yelled, hadn't cursed, hadn't threatened. but she had looked at him like a man already on trial, and now he was. Not in court, not yet. But in the court of public opinion, in department briefings, in the mirror he now avoided when shaving. Vanessa never said she wanted him fired. She didn't need to. All she ever wanted was what the law promised: equal treatment, due process, dignity. Things he tried to strip from her with a smirk and a flashlight. Now that smirk was gone because the power had shifted. Quietly, irreversibly, and Mallory? He wasn't laughing anymore. The story had started as a single roadside humiliation, but it was no longer just about Brad Mallory. Vanessa knew it. The department knew it. And now, the public was starting to see it too. A viral headline might satisfy outrage for a day. A press conference might buy a moment of sympathy. But what happens when the cameras leave? What happens when the uniform changes but the silence stays? Vanessa refused to let this stop fade into another anecdote for dinner tables and hashtags. So while Mallory scrambled to keep his job, she widened her lens. In the weeks that followed, she quietly assembled a coalition. Legal scholars, civil rights attorneys, judicial colleagues, even a retired police captain who had quietly reached out with a message that read simply, "I saw the footage. I believe you. Let me help." They began to dig. What they found was a pattern. Officer Mallory wasn't alone. His name appeared on multiple complaints, almost all dismissed without action. But he was just the face of a wider problem. Dozens of routine stops had turned hostile under his watch. Minorities pulled over for driving too cautiously, appearing nervous, acting evasive, despite video footage proving otherwise, and Mallory wasn't the only one. Internal affairs data, what little was publicly accessible, revealed a trend. Out of 142 civilian complaints over the past 3 years in the precinct, only 6 led to any disciplinary hearing. Of those, none resulted in terminations. Most were resolved informally. The language of non-accountability. Vanessa took this data to the city's Public Safety Oversight Committee. She didn't lead with rage. She led with law. "This isn't about my badge," she told them. "It's about the people who never had one, the ones who went home with a citation they couldn't fight, a broken taillight they couldn't afford to fix, or worse, those who never made it home at all." Her testimony made headlines, but more importantly, it made progress. The committee agreed to audit the department's complaint procedures. The mayor issued a public statement supporting a civilian review board. For the first time in the city's history, officers were required to attend quarterly training focused on de-escalation, implicit bias, and constitutional traffic stop protocol, with an independent agency monitoring compliance. Mallory's case, once considered a PR incident, became a policy inflection point. Even the Georgia Bar Association took note. Vanessa was invited to deliver the keynote at their fall conference. The topic: When Justice Gets Pulled Over, the Limits of the Robe and the Power of Persistence. She began that speech not with her own story, but with someone else's. 15 years ago, she told the audience, a woman named Margaret Green was stopped just outside Augusta. Her son was in the back seat. The officer claimed he fit a description. They were detained for 2 hours. She filed a complaint. It disappeared. No footage, no headlines, no courtroom. She paused. I carry her story with me, because if I forget Margaret, I become the exception. And the system doesn't need exceptions. It needs overhaul. The room stood when she finished. Mallory, meanwhile, remained on unpaid leave. The internal review dragged on. The department never issued an apology, but they didn't reinstate him either. Quietly, they began updating their training manuals. Officers were instructed to treat all traffic stops as if they were being reviewed by a judge, because increasingly they were. Still, Vanessa wasn't interested in ruin. She never said Mallory should lose his life's work. She only insisted that it matter, that when someone abuses authority, the system responds with more than silence. That nuance confused some. A journalist asked her, "Do you feel vindicated?" "No," she replied. "Vindication is personal." This was never about making him feel small. It was about reminding the law it has a face, sometimes one that looks like mine. The journalist didn't know what to say, but the audience watching at home understood, because for them, Vanessa wasn't just a judge. She was a blueprint. Her case had become a case study. Law students were analyzing it in constitutional seminars. Civil rights organizations used it in their training sessions. Even the state attorney general's office issued a memo citing the need to restore community trust through procedural transparency. And through it all, Vanessa remained measured. She still presided over cases, still wore the robe, still parked her Mercedes in the same space. But something in her posture had changed. Not because she was angry, but because she was resolved. Resolved to keep telling the truth even when it was inconvenient. Resolved to hold the line even when she stood alone. Resolved to believe that the law could be made better if only someone had the courage to demand it. And if there was one thing the stop had taught her, it was this: you don't always need to raise your voice to change the system. Sometimes all it takes is knowing how to speak its language. And she was fluent. The courtroom may have been where the insult happened, but Vanessa Cole knew that real accountability wouldn't be found in front of a single judge. It would be forged behind closed doors, on policy drafts, and in the hands of everyday people who rarely made the news. So that's where she went next. It started with a stack of manila folders. Vanessa sat at her dining room table, now cluttered with case files, city budget records, civilian complaint procedures, and public safety ordinances. She didn't have a campaign staff or a PR team. What she had was experience, patience, and clarity. And as it turned out, the number for an old friend, Councilwoman Dion Reyes. Reyes had been a public defender before she entered politics. She'd seen her share of bad stops, flimsy charges, and plea bargains that chewed up lives. When Vanessa called and laid out the blueprint for a proposed community policing and accountability package, Reyes didn't hesitate. The proposal included mandatory release of body and dash cam footage for any civilian complaint within 30 days, independent civilian review boards empowered with subpoena authority, annual police bias training, conducted not internally, but by certified third-party educators, public access to officer disciplinary records, redacted only for personal safety, not reputation. The city council chambers weren't built for emotional drama. They were built for process, debate, delay. But when Vanessa stood and gave testimony, measured, detailed, irrefutable, the room didn't stir with resistance. It shifted with urgency. "This isn't about revenge," she said. "It's about the recognition that without accountability, the badge becomes armor, not a responsibility." The motion passed, unanimously. The mayor signed it in a public ceremony held, at Vanessa's insistence, not on the steps of City Hall, but at Booker T. High School in East Atlanta, where too many of the students already knew what a traffic stop gone wrong looked like. Change was slow, but it wasn't symbolic. Within 3 months, the Civilian Review Board was seated. Within 6, they'd overturned internal decisions on 5 unresolved misconduct cases, 3 of which involved young men who'd been pulled over for looking nervous and detained without cause. Officers who once operated without question now paused, aware that someone was watching, and this time they couldn't hide behind the phrase standard procedure. Vanessa didn't stop there. With her own funds, she launched the Civic Dignity Project, a nonprofit dedicated to educating citizens about their rights in police encounters. The organization offered free legal clinics, translated pamphlets in 6 languages, and partnered with local colleges to train volunteers in courtroom support for those who couldn't afford lawyers. She called it proactive justice, not waiting until the next stop went wrong, but creating a culture where the next stop didn't happen at all. Meanwhile, Officer Mallory sat on the other side of that cultural shift, still on leave, still under review. But something had changed, at he. First, he was defensive, convinced he was being sacrificed for optics. But as the hearings dragged on, and as each complaint against him was reviewed not in isolation, but in context, he began to realize the weight of the pattern he had helped build, and what that meant for the people who'd lived it. He started, attending the required department trainings, not just because he had to, but because he couldn't pretend any longer that routine meant harmless. One afternoon, he pulled aside the instructor after a session on unconscious bias and asked a question that caught the woman off guard. What do I do if I don't know where it comes from? The way I treat people. The way I assume. She looked him in the eye and said, "Start by believing you have something to unlearn." It stuck. Redemption isn't always cinematic. It's not always a teary courtroom confession or a public apology. Sometimes it's as small as a man not reaching for his citation book quite as fast, or choosing to listen instead of escalate. Sometimes it's a moment, quiet, alone, when he watches body cam footage of himself and doesn't like the man on the screen. Mallory never spoke to Vanessa again, not directly, but word reached her through a retired sergeant who still taught at the academy that Brad had started mentoring cadets, telling them that law enforcement was a privilege, not a power move. It wasn't everything, but it was something, and Vanessa knew better than most how hard something was to build. 1 year after the incident, Vanessa stood before a different kind of audience. Law students at Spelman and Morehouse gathered in the packed auditorium for a talk titled, "When Justice is Personal." She didn't wear her robe that day. She wore a gray suit, the same one she wore when she first took the bench. She opened with a question. "How many of you," she asked, "have ever been pulled over and wondered not what you did, but who you were, and whether that would be enough to protect you?" Hands went up. "Too many." She nodded. "That's why we keep fighting, not to punish, but to change what it feels like to be powerless in a system that forgets its job is to protect." Applause filled the room, but Vanessa didn't smile. She knew the applause wasn't for her. It was for the possibility that stories like hers didn't have to be rare, that maybe, just maybe, they could become the new standard, that maybe one day pulling someone over wouldn't be the start of a headline, just a turn signal. Just a conversation. Just safe. Vanessa Cole never intended to become a symbol. She wore a robe, not a cape. She didn't chase justice in the streets or on stages. She sat for it, presided over it, and waited patiently for it to be honored. But when injustice pulled her over on a quiet morning, it didn't see a judge. It saw a target, and that mistake became a lesson. Not just for one officer, but for a system built to look the other way. In the months that followed, Vanessa's story didn't just ripple across courtrooms and city halls. It reached living rooms, classrooms, patrol cars. Parents used it to teach their kids what strength looked like without shouting. Law professors played it for incoming students as proof that law is not abstract, and young officers, some still unsure of their place in the badge, saw what it meant to be held accountable, not destroyed, but humbled. And that's what made the difference. Accountability isn't revenge. It's the reminder that power must answer to truth. That justice isn't a luxury for the few. It's a contract for the many. Mallory never became a hero. He wasn't meant to. But his silence in court, his resignation from patrol duty, and the quiet fact that he was later seen attending a Know Your Rights seminar in the back row, hood up, eyes forward, meant something. Redemption didn't come with fireworks. It came with humility. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He earned reflection. Vanessa, for her part, returned to her bench. She resumed ruling on petty thefts, custody disputes, eviction appeals. She gave the same weight to every case, because that's what justice demands. But every now and then, she caught someone looking at her differently, a bailiff, a clerk, a public defender, with reverence, with caution, with gratitude, and when asked what changed most for her after that stop, Vanessa never spoke of fear. She spoke of clarity. "I always believed the system could work," she said once, "but now I know it has to be reminded. And sometimes, it's not about changing the law. It's about showing what happens when the wrong person thinks you don't belong." She paused, letting those words settle. Because the day we stop defending our right to exist equally, that's the day we lose. The right to call it justice. In the end, it wasn't about a badge, a car, or even a courtroom. It was about dignity. And in a country where a routine stop can spiral into humiliation, or worse, Vanessa Cole reminded us that power is at its most dangerous when it forgets. It has limits. But she didn't just remind the officer. She reminded all of us. So now it's our turn to stay aware, to ask questions, to teach, to vote, to share. Because justice, real justice, isn't found by accident. It's demanded, and it's protected every day by people who refuse to be quiet, especially when they wear the robe.